Their bodies, thin and starved from months of captivity, trembled not from fear, but from the shock of the situation. The cowboys spoke simple words of welcome, their faces soft, unmarked by hatred. These were the men they had been trained to despise, to view as nothing more than enemies, capable of nothing but violence and cruelty. And yet here they were, offering food, real food, not the scraps they had endured in prison camps. The Thanksgiving feast spread before them felt more like an impossible dream than a reality. How could this be? How could these men, once seen as nothing more than the enemy, treat them this way? Were these acts of kindness some kind of deception? Or were they truly being seen as human, as equals, for the first time since the war began? Their stomachs ached for more. But the question remained, could they accept what was being offered without betraying everything they had believed in? The women stood frozen at the threshold of the small rustic cabin, their eyes wide and their hands gripping the worn doorframe, as if the very act of stepping inside might break some unspoken law. It was a simple gesture, a warm invitation from their captors, but to them it felt like a world-shattering contradiction. They had been trained to expect nothing but cruelty, abuse, and perhaps death at the hands of the Americans. To surrender was to dishonor their families, their emperor, their nation. The thought of it had always been unbearable. Yet here they were, on the other side of the enemy's line, hearing words they had never expected to hear. An invitation to dinner, to sit at the same table as their captors, and to share a meal that was, in itself, unimaginable. The myth of the cruel enemy, drilled into their minds since childhood, was not just a narrative, it was a fundamental belief, one that had shaped their every action during the war. The American soldiers were the demons, the savages, the ones who would never treat them as human. They had been told of atrocities committed by the enemy, of soldiers who took no prisoners and would show no mercy. These were not men. They were monsters, driven by an insatiable thirst for power. And yet, here in this cabin, there were no guns raised, no harsh words spat. The air smelled of food, the warmth of a fire crackled in the hearth, and there was laughter, genuine, easy laughter. It felt like a dream, too surreal to be real. How could this be happening? How could these men, her captors, be so different from the faceless monsters they had been told to fear? The question gnawed at the women as they reluctantly stepped inside. Each one walked slowly, eyes scanning the room, half expecting someone to laugh, to shout, to remind them of the truth they had been raised to believe. But nothing came. Instead, there were smiles, simple, unthreatening, and hands outstretched in welcome. It was as if their captors had read their confusion and offered nothing but kindness in return. The warm, golden light of the room felt foreign, almost like a dream that didn't belong in the reality they had known. For the women, capture had always been worse than death. To surrender was to lose everything, family, honor, even the meaning of life itself. They had been taught that to live as a prisoner was to live without dignity, without purpose. They would be treated like animals, used for labor, starved, beaten, humiliated. Their lives would be cheap, measured only in terms of what information they could offer or how long they could be of use. They had been told this by their leaders, by their families, by the very culture that had shaped them. So, when they stepped into this cabin, they were prepared for the worst. It was their fate, the price of surrender. It was the price of living. But this? This was something they couldn't fathom. As they sat down at the table, their hunger gnawing at them from the inside, they could hardly bring themselves to reach for the food. It felt wrong, so wrong, that it might be some kind of trick. The Americans had made a joke of their suffering, offering them something they could never take, never accept. Yet, as their eyes fell upon the food, as they saw the mounds of mashed potatoes, the golden turkey, the freshly baked bread, they couldn't help but notice the hunger that had consumed them for months, slowly giving way to something else. A deep yearning. The fear of dishonor, the fear of disgrace, pulled at their hearts, but their stomachs cried for the food before them. They had been starved, both physically and emotionally, for so long that the idea of refusing it, of turning it away, felt like another kind of betrayal. For the first time since their capture, they saw their captors not as monsters, but as men who were, in their own way, offering them something essential, human decency. The food was not just sustenance. It was a gesture, an act of compassion that none of them had expected. To be treated with kindness, even by their enemies, was an emotional blow, one that they could not yet understand. The simple act of sharing a meal so full of life and warmth, made them question everything they had ever been taught about honor and war. Could it be that the Americans were not the monsters they had been told to fear? Was there some truth to what they had witnessed here, in this small, humble cabin? The women exchanged silent glances, their minds racing as the warmth of the meal began to thaw the ice that had built up around their hearts. They were afraid to let go of everything they had ever believed, and yet, with each bite, the walls inside them began to crumble. The myth of the cruel enemy started to dissipate, replaced by something far more complex, something they were just beginning to understand. Their journey had begun, not on the battlefield, but here, at this table, where something as simple as kindness would change them forever. The question that lingered in the air, unspoken but clear, was this: if the enemy could show them kindness, what else had been a lie? As the women stepped into the cowboys' cabin, the overwhelming scent of roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, and sweet pies filled the air. It was a sensory assault they had never experienced in captivity, so rich, so foreign to the hunger they had known for months. The warmth from the fire crackling in the hearth seeped into their cold bones, but it did little to soothe the knot of confusion and disbelief that gripped their chests. The room, simple yet filled with an unexpected abundance, felt like an illusion, a surreal escape from the reality of war they had lived in until now. The rough-hewn wood walls, the low beams, the hand-painted plates stacked on the table, it all felt too normal, too peaceful, for a world that had taught them to expect only suffering. They hesitated at the threshold, the weight of the past months pressing heavily on them. Their minds couldn't reconcile this new world they were stepping into. They had been told, time and again, that Americans were ruthless. The propaganda had painted them as savages, cold and merciless, men who would strip them of everything, leaving only the bitter taste of defeat. But here, in this cabin, the soldiers who had taken them prisoner were offering not violence, but warmth. The contrast was almost too much for their minds to process. Each woman moved slowly, unsure of what to do. The thick scents of the meal seemed to swirl around them, reminding them of the last time they had eaten. A meager ration of rice and fish that had barely satisfied their hunger. Here, in this room, food was piled high, more than they could possibly consume. The soft glow of the lamps illuminated their captors, who were seated around the table, chatting easily with one another. The cowboys spoke among themselves, their voices deep and friendly, carrying an easy warmth that felt completely out of place in the women's world. As they were led to the table, their eyes scanned the food, the abundance almost dizzying. They hadn't seen a full meal like this in so long that their minds struggled to comprehend it. The mashed potatoes were creamy, the turkey golden and tender, and the sweet, fruity scent of pie filled the room. The women glanced at one another, their instincts still on high alert. Could they trust what was before them? Could they lower their guard long enough to accept this unexpected offering? The fear was still there, rooted deep in their bones, but the hunger was louder. And after weeks of surviving on scraps, the pull of the food was too strong to resist. The silence around the table was thick with internal conflict. Some women chewed cautiously, as if every bite was a betrayal. They couldn't help but glance up at their captors every so often, wondering if the kindness would suddenly turn to cruelty. Were they being watched? Were the cowboys enjoying their discomfort? For others, however, the taste of the food was like nothing they had ever known, rich, comforting, filling in a way they had long forgotten. The warmth of the meal spread through their bodies, breaking down the barriers of mistrust, if only for a moment. Some of them dared to let the food soothe their hunger without the burden of guilt, but the questions still remained. Was this really just food, or was it a manipulation? A slow poison disguised as a feast. For a few of the women, the act of eating felt almost impossible. They stared at their plate, unsure of how to proceed. The food seemed like a symbol of something bigger, something they didn't understand. Thanksgiving, a word that meant nothing to them, felt too foreign, too out of place in a war that had consumed every part of their lives. It wasn't just the food that confused them. It was the very concept of sitting down to a meal like this in the middle of a war. The idea of Thanksgiving itself was alien to them. They had been raised in a culture that saw sacrifice, not celebration, as the highest form of loyalty. The idea of giving thanks seemed to have no place in a world where everything was lost and every action was a means of survival. What could they possibly be grateful for? What was there to celebrate in this new world, where they had been reduced to prisoners, to objects of propaganda? Yet as the meal continued, something began to change. The laughter from the cowboys, the ease with which they spoke to the women, there was no mockery, no cruelty, just a simple, quiet companionship. It was as if the Americans understood that this meal, this moment, could be more than just food. It could be a bridge. For the women, it was a moment of sheer confusion, a glimmer of something they couldn't yet name. This was no longer just about survival. It was about something deeper, something unspoken, but very much real. This dinner was their first taste of a world that existed beyond war, a world where humanity could still endure. And that thought, simple as it was, began to plant seeds of doubt about everything they had ever been told, everything they had ever believed. The minutes stretched on, and as the women slowly, almost hesitantly, ate their meal, the weight of what they were experiencing began to settle in their minds. They had been trained to think of their captors as monsters, as enemies to be feared and destroyed. But now, sitting around this table with men who had fought on the opposite side, everything they had been taught felt distant, almost hollow. The very idea of receiving kindness from the enemy tore at their sense of identity. Could they reconcile the warm, peaceful atmosphere of the cabin with the harsh propaganda they had internalized for so long? The contradiction gnawed at their minds as they chewed each bite of food, their thoughts in turmoil. The women had been raised on the certainty that the enemy had no honor. They had been told that Americans were cruel and ruthless, that they would stop at nothing to degrade and humiliate their prisoners. But here, around this table, there was no cruelty. There was only the simple, strange act of kindness, a kindness that felt foreign, almost alien. The turkey, the mashed potatoes, the pie. It wasn't just food. It was a symbol of something deeper, something that had no place in the world they had known. The very concept of sharing a meal with their captors made them question everything. Had their enemies been misrepresented? Had they been fed lies about the nature of the world outside? The women struggled to hold on to their beliefs about honor, loyalty, and duty, but with each passing moment, it became harder to do so. The challenge of ideology was no longer just theoretical. It was now a deeply personal battle. The emotional struggle to accept the kindness being shown to them was overwhelming. They had been trained to believe that their loyalty to Japan, to their homeland, was the most sacred part of their identity. But now, in the face of this unexpected generosity, they were being forced to question that loyalty. Was their duty to their country really more important than the humanity they were being offered here across the table from their enemies? Could they still hold on to the image of the enemy as a faceless monster when those very men had shown them nothing but kindness? The emotional disconnect was palpable. The women were torn between the loyalty they had been taught to feel and the growing understanding that the men who had captured them were, in fact, human beings offering something precious: food, warmth, and respect. There was an overwhelming sense of guilt as they ate, each bite carrying with it the weight of their conflicting emotions. It was one thing to acknowledge the kindness of their captors, but it was another to accept it, to let it in. Their minds were still shackled by the beliefs they had carried with them from the battlefield. Could they truly accept the food without feeling like they were betraying their families, their comrades, their country? Some women were able to push these thoughts aside, allowing themselves to savor the meal in silence, if only for a moment. The warmth of the food, the richness of the flavors, provided a brief escape from the chaos of their minds. They tried to focus on the immediate comfort the meal offered, allowing their senses to wash over them without the weight of ideological conflict. But even as they chewed, their thoughts circled back to the same question. What did this kindness mean? Was it simply an act of decency, or was there something more to it? The guilt gnawed at them, but they couldn't deny the relief that came with the warmth of the food, the soft conversation around the table, the simple normalcy of it all. For others, the emotional struggle was more intense. The very idea of accepting food from the enemy felt like a betrayal. How could they enjoy this meal when their families were suffering, when their country lay in ruins? The emotional burden of the war, their sense of duty to their homeland, hung heavily on their shoulders. It was impossible to ignore the stark contrast between their current reality and the one they had been taught to expect. The camp had been harsh, but this dinner, this moment, was something entirely different. And with that difference came a flood of questions, questions that neither they nor their captors could answer. In the end, it wasn't just the food they were eating, it was the emotions, the doubts, and the confusion that came with it. The kindness of the Americans was undeniable, but so too was the deep conflict within the women. As they sat at the table, chewing slowly, they were not just prisoners at a feast, they were soldiers caught between two worlds, two ideologies, two ways of seeing the enemy. Each bite was an act of defiance against everything they had been taught. Each bite was a step toward understanding that maybe, just maybe, the enemy wasn't as monstrous as they had been told. As the last of the pie was served, the women sat back, the weight of the meal settling heavily in their stomachs. But it wasn't just the food that had left an impression on them. It was the realization that this dinner, this simple act of kindness, had begun to unravel everything they had been taught about their captors. Their minds raced, still reeling from the sensory overload and emotional strain of the evening. They had been told that Americans were ruthless, that their soldiers would show no mercy, and yet the men before them had treated them with nothing but respect. The warmth of the cabin, the laughter, the genuine hospitality, it was all so far removed from the images they had been raised to fear. The women exchanged glances, and for the first time, they weren't just looking at each other. They were seeing the Americans differently, too. The shift in perception came slowly, but it was undeniable. The cowboys, who had been nothing but shadows in their minds, representing the enemy, were now individuals in their own right. They were men who spoke to them with kindness, who offered them food and warmth without hesitation. As the women looked around the table, they began to understand something they had never considered. The enemy was not some faceless force, but a group of individuals, each with their own story, their own suffering, and their own experiences. The man who had served them turkey was not just an American soldier. He was a person, a human being with hopes, fears, and a life far removed from the battlefield. They had been taught to hate him without ever knowing him, and now, sitting at the same table, they were forced to confront the truth. They had been wrong. As the evening wore on, the women began to see the cowboys in a new light. They had been given food, and in turn, they had been given respect. The simple act of kindness was more than just a meal. It was an invitation to see the humanity in each other, regardless of the uniforms they wore. For the first time since their capture, the women felt something beyond fear and hatred. They felt seen. They felt human again. The realization of shared humanity was profound. It was no longer about who was the enemy and who was the ally. It was about recognizing that both sides were human, capable of kindness, capable of suffering. The cowboys, through their simple acts of generosity, had shattered the walls the women had built around their hearts. The meal was not just an act of survival. It was a bridge between two groups who had been taught to hate each other. The women were no longer just captives. They were individuals with their own feelings, their own dignity. And as they sat at that table, surrounded by the warmth of a meal, they understood something crucial. They were deserving of respect, not because of their nationality or their allegiance, but because of their humanity. The war had stripped them of many things, but it had not taken away their ability to connect, to understand, and to change. For the women, the journey ahead was no longer about simply surviving. It was about understanding the deeper truths of their situation, the truths that lay beyond the battlefield. And the first truth they had learned tonight was that the enemy was not so different from them after all. But as the warmth of the meal faded and the women returned to their quarters, a new weight settled upon them. The kindness they had been shown, so simple, so unexpected, became an emotional battleground, one where their minds clashed with their deepest beliefs. The generosity of the cowboys was undeniable, but with each moment of warmth, a deeper, more painful question arose within them. What did it mean for them to accept this hospitality? Could they reconcile the kindness they had received with the hatred they had been raised to feel? For many of the women, the guilt of survival was overwhelming. The very act of eating, of accepting food and shelter from the enemy, felt like a betrayal of everything they had been taught to believe. They had been raised on the principle that surrender was dishonorable, that to survive captivity was to abandon one's honor. Now, as they lay in their bunks, unable to shake the memories of the meal, they felt a profound sense of shame. How could they accept food from the very men they had been trained to see as cruel and inhumane? How could they eat at the table of the enemy without dishonoring everything they had been taught to hold sacred? As the days passed, the question of loyalty began to tear at their hearts. Some of the women, their minds still clouded by propaganda, wrestled with the idea that accepting kindness from their captors was a form of betrayal, not just to their country, but to the ideals they had been taught to uphold. They had been told that the enemy was nothing more than a force of evil, a beast to be destroyed. Now, in the face of this unexpected kindness, they were being forced to confront a painful truth. Could loyalty to their country still be honored if they allowed themselves to see the enemy as human? Were they betraying their families, their comrades, and their nation by accepting that kindness, by acknowledging the humanity of those they had been trained to hate? The most profound shift, however, was the identity crisis that began to unfold within each of the women. Their lives had been defined by war, by honor, and by their duty to their country. They had been raised to see themselves as warriors, as defenders of their homeland, with no room for anything else. To accept kindness from the enemy was to break that identity, to acknowledge that perhaps the enemy was not the faceless villain they had been told to fear, and that realization shattered them. If they were no longer the warriors they had been trained to be, if they were no longer defined by their role in the war, who were they now? What did it mean to be a woman, a human being, if not a soldier at war? As they lay in their bunks, staring at the dark ceiling, they realized that this was the true battle, facing the person they had become in the face of such unexpected kindness. The war outside could be fought with weapons, with strategy, with force. But this war, the war within, was far more complex, and for the first time since their capture, they understood that their journey was not just about surviving the war, it was about learning to live in a world where the lines between enemy and friend were no longer clear. And that was a battle none of them had ever been prepared for. In the days that followed the Thanksgiving dinner, the women's minds continued to churn with the contradictions they had witnessed. The initial shock of being treated with kindness by the very men they had been raised to hate began to settle into something deeper. The once absurd notion of sitting at the table with their captors, sharing a meal, began to shift in their minds. It was no longer an anomaly or a momentary lapse in the cruelty they expected. It had become a symbol of something far greater than they had ever imagined. The dinner had not just filled their bellies, it had filled the gaps in their understanding, forcing them to confront the humanity of their captors. They started to see the Cowboys differently. The men who had once been little more than faceless enemies were now becoming individuals in their eyes. The idea that these men were part of the same human struggle, trapped in the same war, began to sink in. They had been taught to view the Americans as monsters, ruthless and driven only by power and greed. But the kindness they had experienced showed them another side. Slowly, they began to recognize that these men were not so different from them. They, too, were caught in the machinery of war, driven by forces beyond their control. And that realization began to change everything. The Cowboys were no longer enemies to be despised. They were men who, like the women, had their own families, their own struggles, their own humanity. It was this empathy, the ability to see their captors as human beings, that began to heal the emotional wounds the women had carried with them. In the weeks that followed, the transformation was subtle but undeniable. The women began to reject the propaganda they had been raised on, the lies that had shaped their world view for so long. They had been taught that the Americans were barbaric and unworthy of respect. But as they spent more time in the camp, observing their captors, their beliefs began to unravel. The Cowboys were not the savages they had imagined. They were just men who had been forced into war, just as they had been. This shift was not easy. The propaganda had been ingrained in them for years, fed to them from childhood, and reinforced by their military training. To suddenly let go of those beliefs was like shedding a skin they had worn their whole lives, but the more they observed, the more they understood. The Cowboys treated them with dignity, with care, and they began to realize that the truth they had been told about the enemy was far more complicated than they had been led to believe. The truth wasn't black and white. It was filled with shades of gray, and that was the hardest lesson of all. As the days passed, the women began to feel lighter. They walked through the camp with more purpose, their shoulders no longer burdened by the weight of hatred and fear. They had not been broken by their captors. Instead, they had been shown that survival did not mean losing their humanity. It meant embracing it. The kindness they had received had opened something in them, a door that had long been closed. They began to see themselves not just as survivors, but as people capable of empathy, of connection, of healing. And that was a transformation that would stay with them long after the war ended. In the quiet moments, as they sat together in their barracks or worked side by side with the cowboys, they understood something important. They were no longer defined by the war. They were not just victims. They were human beings with the capacity to love, to forgive, and to heal. It was this realization that would carry them forward, no matter what the future held. But despite the warmth they had experienced, and the small moments of peace they had found, the weight of their past actions still loomed large. The Thanksgiving dinner had sparked something deep within them, a shift in perception, a new understanding of the enemy, and yet it had also brought the ghosts of their pasts to the surface. As they settled into the routine of the camp, the emotional rift left by the meal grew harder to ignore. The warmth of the present clashed violently with the darkness of their memories. They had been given food, given respect, given kindness, and yet, in the stillness of the night, the memories of the war returned with haunting clarity. The weight of past actions pressed heavily on the women as they were forced to confront the things they had done, the roles they had played in the war, and the consequences of those actions. Flashbacks to their time in service resurfaced like uninvited visitors. They remembered their first days on the front lines, the training they had received, the orders they had followed. They had been soldiers, young and idealistic, raised to serve their country above all else. But in the midst of battle, ideals had often collided with the brutal reality of war. They had been forced to act in ways that, at the time, felt justified, attacking, defending, and enduring horrors that would haunt them forever. Now, sitting in the relative calm of the American camp, those actions felt distant but still painfully real. The internal conflict became more pronounced with each passing day. As the women grappled with the kindness they had received, they were forced to question their loyalty to their country. Their national identity, their sense of duty, had been everything to them. They had been taught that to be loyal to their country meant to put everything else aside. But now, sitting with their captors, those boundaries began to blur. The loyalty to their homeland had been their guiding light for so long, and yet the reality they were now living in forced them to wonder. Had they been loyal to the right cause? Were they truly fighting for something noble? Or had they simply been pawns in a war that would never truly have an end? The realization that the Americans were not so different from them was difficult to accept, but it began to sink in slowly. The Cowboys, once seen as the enemy, were now human beings, men who had been forced to fight just as they had. The true enemy was not the Americans at all, but the war itself. It was the war that had taken away their innocence, that had taken their lives and the lives of others, and had created an endless cycle of suffering. It was the war that had turned them into something they had never intended to be: killers, survivors, and women broken by the violence around them. The true enemy was the war, and it had left scars that would last a lifetime. As the women continued to work alongside their captors, their minds often returned to these questions. The war had stripped them of so much, but perhaps the most painful loss was their sense of self. They had been taught to fight, to serve, to die for their country. But now, in the quiet moments of reflection, they began to understand that the war had taken away more than their lives. It had taken away their humanity. And in its place, a new question arose. Who were they now? Were they still the soldiers they had once been, or had they become something else altogether? The journey to find that answer would be long, but it was a journey they had already begun. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They could no longer define themselves by the war. It was time to begin defining themselves by who they were now, human beings, capable of empathy, capable of healing, and capable of change. The days following the Thanksgiving dinner were a blur of routine and reflection. Despite the warmth they had experienced at the table, despite the shift in how they saw their captors, the women found themselves back in the cold, harsh reality of the camp. The barracks were still cramped, the air still thick with the smell of dust and the echo of boots marching past. The guards still patrolled, their faces set in indifference, just as before. It was as if nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The transformation they had undergone, sparked by a simple meal and a moment of shared humanity, was something they could not undo. But as they returned to their daily lives, they were forced to confront the tension between the new selves they were becoming and the old world that still surrounded them. The return to routine was disorienting. The women had seen something different in the Cowboys, something they had never expected. In the quiet moments, they found themselves replaying the dinner in their minds, reflecting on the kindness, the respect, and the humanity they had been shown. They could no longer see their captors as the monsters they had once believed them to be. But the camp, the cold walls, the guards, everything about their present life was a reminder of the divide between what they had seen and what they were still living. They had tasted warmth, but they were now surrounded by coldness. They had experienced compassion, but they were still treated as prisoners. And with each passing day, the conflict within them deepened. How could they reconcile these two worlds, the one they had come from and the one they had encountered in the midst of their captivity? The internal struggle among the women intensified as they wrestled with their conflicting beliefs. Each of them had to confront their past and decide how to move forward. For some, the war had been black and white. There were enemies, and there was loyalty to their country. But now, with the experiences they had lived through in the camp, those lines had blurred. Could they continue to be loyal to their homeland when their captors had shown them so much humanity? Was it possible to survive in this new reality without losing their sense of self, their sense of duty, and their honor? These questions haunted them, pulling at their minds, creating an emotional turmoil that no meal or moment of kindness could erase. The struggle was not just about survival, it was about what kind of person they wanted to be when the war was over. Would they go back to their old lives with the same rigid beliefs, or would they embrace the possibility that the world they had been fighting for was not the only world that existed? This was the true emotional battle. It wasn't the physical hardship of captivity that threatened to break them. It was the challenge of reconciling what they had been taught with what they were now experiencing. It was the challenge of reconciling the humanity they had encountered with the loyalty they had been raised to feel. And that battle, the one inside each of them, would be the hardest one to fight. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to like the video and leave a comment below saying where you're watching from. Your support helps bring more stories like this to life. As the days passed, the transformation in the women became more evident. They began to embrace the emotional changes that had quietly taken root within them. The Thanksgiving dinner, once an unexpected anomaly, had slowly become a turning point in their lives. It had been the catalyst for something deeper, something they could no longer ignore. The women who had once identified solely as soldiers, bound by duty and the harsh codes of war, were now beginning to shed those identities. The armor they had worn for so long, both physical and emotional, was starting to loosen. They could feel the weight of it lifting, as if the very act of acknowledging the kindness of their captors had cracked open something inside them. The walls they had built around their hearts, forged by years of hatred and fear, were starting to crumble. The influence of the Cowboys, however subtle, remained a constant force in their transformation. These men, once seen as the faceless enemy, had become individuals in their eyes. The simple acts of kindness, the offer of food, the respectful way they had been treated, had a lasting impact. The women found themselves looking at their captors in a new light, no longer seeing them as symbols of oppression or aggression. The Cowboys were men who had shown them warmth, who had shared a meal with them without any agenda. The gap between the enemy and the prisoner had begun to close, and in its place, a sense of common humanity had begun to flourish. No longer did the women see only the uniform, the rifle, the role of the soldier. They began to see the individuals beneath those uniforms, the men who, like them, had been swept into the tide of war. It wasn't that the women had forgotten the pain of war or the atrocities they had witnessed. It was that they could now see the complexity of their captors. They had been soldiers too, just as they had been. They had suffered, they had lost, and they had been shaped by the same forces that had shaped the women. As the days went on, the women began to carry this understanding with them. They no longer defined themselves solely by their roles as soldiers, nor by the pain of the past. They began to define themselves by their capacity for compassion, for understanding, and for growth. It was not an easy journey. The scars of war still marked their bodies and minds. But as they navigated the complexities of their changing identities, they came to realize that their greatest strength was not in their ability to fight, but in their ability to love, to forgive, and to heal. The Cowboys had unknowingly given them the tools to rebuild themselves, not as victims of war, but as survivors who had discovered the power of empathy and connection. The quiet revolution had begun within them, and it would continue long after the war was over. As the war came to its final chapters, the women found themselves preparing to return to a world they no longer recognized. The journey home was long, filled with the bitter taste of mixed emotions. They had survived the brutality of war, but they had also been forever changed by the unexpected kindness they had encountered in captivity. As they boarded the transport ships that would take them back to their homeland, their hearts were heavy with the knowledge that the world they were returning to was one of devastation and loss, a far cry from the tentative peace they had found in the kindness of their captors. The landscape outside the ship's windows was a blur of ocean and sky, but in their minds the images of the Thanksgiving dinner, the warmth, the laughter, and the humanity of their captors were sharp and vivid. The journey home was bittersweet, for they knew they could never forget the kindness they had received, and the world they returned to would never feel the same. Returning home was not the triumphant return they had once imagined. It was not the return of soldiers who had fought valiantly for their country. Instead, it was the return of women who had been forced to reckon with the deepest parts of themselves, with the war's true cost, and with the humanity they had found in the very men they had once been taught to hate. As they stepped onto the familiar soil of their homeland, they were met with silence. The streets were filled with rubble, the once thriving cities reduced to ruins. It was a land scarred by the war, its people weary and broken. The women were no longer the same. Their eyes had been opened to the complexities of humanity, to the realization that not all enemies were evil and not all acts of kindness were born out of weakness. They carried the lessons learned from the Thanksgiving dinner, and with them a burden. How could they reconcile the kindness they had received with the country that had sent them to fight a war that had torn their world apart? The difficulty of returning home was not just about the physical landscape of their country, it was about the emotional distance that had grown between them and the world they had left behind. They returned to a country that had suffered, a land that was still reeling from the devastation of war. But as they walked through the streets, they couldn't help but remember the kindness of their captors, the warmth of the meal, the respect they had been shown, and the humanity that had transcended national borders. How could they explain to their families and their fellow countrymen that the enemy they had been taught to fear was capable of kindness? How could they reconcile the love they had felt for their country with the understanding that there were men, no different from them, who had shown them compassion when they had expected only cruelty? The emotional weight of this realization settled heavily on their shoulders as they returned to their families, who expected them to be the same women who had left, strong, loyal, and unquestioning. But they were not the same. They had seen the truth of human kindness, and that truth had changed them forever. The legacy of Thanksgiving was not something they could easily forget. It was a memory that would stay with them, a symbol of the kindness they had found in the most unlikely of places. In the midst of a war that had stripped them of so much, they had found a moment of human connection that transcended the hatred and violence surrounding them. It was a lesson they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. The true victory of war, they realized, was not in the defeat of an enemy. It was in the preservation of humanity. And the Thanksgiving dinner, a simple meal shared across enemy lines, had reminded them of that truth. It had shown them that even in the darkest of times, even in the midst of war, there was still the possibility for compassion, for kindness, and for healing. If you liked this story, be sure to like the video and comment below about where you're watching from. Your support keeps these stories alive.